Hey up, so here it is, the review of the new Royal Enfield 350 Classic. Now, you may have noticed my attire on this video. That's because this video is a homage to those riders from the 1940s, 50s and into the 1960s. Back then, motorcycles were transport and they weren't allowed to interfere with a gentleman's style. And of course, the fashion of the day was a smart tweed sports jacket, a shirt and tie, some slacks and a pair of sensible shoes. And just to preempt any comments, I was wearing a Knox armoured base layer underneath my shirt just in case of a spill. Classic attire for what is one of the most classic and iconic motorcycles in motorcycle history. You may well hear me refer to this bike as the Bullet, where people often correct me that it's actually the Classic. Well, the point is, Royal Enfield Classic series is a homage to the original Royal Enfield Bullet that was built between 1934 through until 1949. It's still a Bullet, it's just the classic version of the Bullet. Now, I've had this bike a little over 3 weeks. Obviously, I'm busy running the channel. I've got to get 2 videos out a week. And I also needed time to get to grips with this new bike. And I needed to get to know it properly rather than just slinging out a quick first impressions video. Now, if you want to know what all the technical specs are for this bike, go online and have a look at the brochure. That's not how I do my reviews. I'll show you around the bike in a few minutes, but first let's discuss what the bike is like to ride. Although the new Classic 350 shares the same chassis, engine and for the most part running gear with its sister the Meteor, it's actually a very different animal to ride. It is a classic sit-up and beg style, but unlike the Meteor, it's a slightly more focused riding position. By no means extreme, but it does move the rider's centre of gravity slightly, giving the rider a greater sense of control and stability. To me, the new Classic 350 feels just that little bit sportier than the Meteor, more nimble and reactive to the rider's command. The tyres are a little bit wider than the outgoing Bullet models, giving you just a little bit more rubber in contact with the road. This enhances the bike's cornering abilities, but it does come at a price. I've noticed that the new 350 does have a propensity for tramlining on, road markings and repair seams on the road, something that my old Bullet never does, but unfortunately something that wider tyres are prone to. It's not an issue because most modern bikes do it. It's just a fact of life with most modern motorcycles. The trade-off, of course, being extra grip when cornering or having to pull the bike to a halt swiftly. And there's no doubt about it, this bike does handle slightly better than the old Bullets. The beefed up frame compared to the old models is no doubt partly responsible for this. I feel that the new suspension on these bikes is far superior to that was fitted with the older Bullets. It feels quite firm initially, but still succeeds in soaking up all but the waste that the road can throw at you. I even went into Hull's Old Town and tested it out on our old 16th century granite cobbled streets, which is a pretty harsh test for any motorcycle. Now, don't get me wrong, you certainly know that you're travelling on these roads, but both the front and rear suspension didn't miss a beat. I've ridden bikes on these roads that cost 4 times what this little Bullet costs, that completely lost the plot in the process, but the Bullet retained its composure. I've found it's quite common for rear suspension on a bike to start skipping on road surfaces like this. With rebound often not being able to keep up with compression, the bikes often get bogged down and basically just run out of travel, quickly transferring every jolt straight up the rider's spine. Or sometimes it can go the other way, where rebound is faster than compression, and the back tyre starts to lose contact with the road surface. And that's why I always think these primitive road surfaces are a good test of suspension. Even at low speeds it pushes compression and rebound to its limits, allowing virtually no recovery time. But Royal Enfield seem to have put a lot of thought into the suspension this time on this bike, and I think they've got it as near perfect as you could possibly expect for a bike that's only around £4,500. Now, putting the bigger tyres and the Supreme suspension together and then adding them to the new seat, which has been both sort of downgraded and upgraded at the same time, you end up with a bike that is supremely comfortable to ride, and I would say it's even better than my mule. The downgrade relates to the seat springs now being removed. They no longer come as standard, but you can buy them as an optional extra. But in compensation for this, Royal Enfield have fitted a much thicker, plusher saddle. Comfort-wise, for me, the new 350 is perfect. The reach to the handlebars is perfect, the foot peg positioning is perfect, and the suspension for me at the moment seems perfect. But what about the engine and that gearbox? Honest opinion, it's the best engine and the best gearbox Royal Enfield have turned out so far. Despite being a single, to me it feels like a refined twin to ride. There is absolutely no vibration, just a reassuring feedback from the engine through the chassis and the handlebars. In fact, it's so smooth that there were times pulling up to traffic lights when I thought the engine had cut out. RE have definitely pulled a rabbit out of the hat with this one. With just over 20 horsepower on tap, this is no speed machine, but we all know that, and speed and power are not what this bike is about. It is, however, a very tractable and responsive engine. Biggest frustration at the moment is that obviously I'm still running it in. I'm in the first stage of running, and you can feel that just where you've got to stop, that's where the engine wants to be off. You're stopping just as you sort of get into its happy zone. The gearbox is perfect, and I mean perfect. From the start, the gearbox has behaved impeccably, with none of those usual running in glitches that you expect with a new bike. Royal Enfield are very good at gearboxes, but this is the slickest and the smoothest gearbox so far. And somehow the 5-speed box does seem to suit this little bullet better than it did the Meteor. I did notice that Royal Enfield have dropped the gear indicator from the LCD display that is sported by the Meteor, which was a bit of a surprise. Personally, it doesn't bother me, but I can appreciate that's probably going to be a disappointment for some. It's a very forgiving engine and gearbox combination. The engine doesn't seem to care that much what gear you're in. Even in its relatively tight new state, the engine doesn't complain if you try to accelerate quite hard from 30 miles an hour in top gear, and there was absolutely no indication of piston slap when you're putting that kind of strain on the engine. The clutch does feel fractionally heavier than it does on my 500. I soon got used to that. Either way, this bike is a delight on the open road, and it feels light and nimble in traffic. The exhaust note's muted, but there's just enough of it to give the rider satisfaction when he's riding. It doesn't sound loud, but it sounds powerful, if that makes any sense. Now, I'll be honest, I've not compared the weight between the old 500 and this newer 350. I suspect they're very similar. But weight is relative, it's how it's distributed on a bike, not how much there is of it. And what I will say is that when it comes to manhandling this in and out of the garage, it is much easier and feels much lighter than the 500 does. As well as the gear indicator, also conspicuous by its absence is the famous Royal Enfield Tripper. for some reason, and I suspect I know what that reason is, they've omitted it from this bike. And when you're paying a premium for this bike over the Meteor, that does feel like a bit of a raw deal. This bike does obviously have provision for the Tripper, and theoretically you can fit one as an optional extra, but at the moment there are none available for the UK or European market. This 350, like the Meteor, does have a sort of a big bike feel about it when you sat astride it, and the seating position is quite tall, but, and again, as far as I'm aware, there are none available in the UK at the moment. There is a lower seat option, which I believe brings the seat height down by about 30mm, which should be good news for the vertically challenged. Now, when looking at the new 350, you can be forgiven for thinking that there are a lot of components on it which have been taken straight from the last generation Bullet. But actually, I've put both bikes side by side, and there are only 2 or 3 components that I can honestly say have been swapped over. Although the mudguards look the same, they are wider. Although the tank looks the same, it's a slightly different design. And even the famous Royal Enfield casket that houses the clocks and the headlamp is a different design. This is truly a brand new motorcycle from the ground up. Royal Enfield haven't just designed a new platform that can accommodate all the old parts. 99.9% of the components on this bike are brand new. Yet somehow they've managed to retain the classic look and DNA of the original Classic. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say is they've made it look more genuine Classic than the last iteration. They've definitely employed more plastics in the construction of this bike. Although the side cases have metal covers, the actual boxes themselves are ABS. The chrome surround around the clocks and the LCD display I think is metal, but it could be plastic. But what definitely is plastic is that chrome surround on the ignition, which does feel very cheap. And I predict that it's also going to be very susceptible to inaccurate key insertions. On my chrome version of the bike, all the metalwork apart from the tank and the mudguards is a lovely gloss black, and it looks to me to have been very skillfully applied. What I wasn't quite so impressed with was the finish of the chrome on the mudguards, which on my bike isn't as good as it was on the 500. And the red paintwork that goes with it, both on the mudguards and on the tank. The whole thing seems to have been rushed. There are very obvious masking lines on the mudguards front and rear which should have been polished off during the production process, but somehow missed that final stage of finishing. And there are several what look to me to be fingerprints underneath the lacquer on the tank, which does mar its appearance somewhat. Now, I'm not going to make a big thing of this in this review because I don't think it's indicative of Royal Enfield's general finishing. I know that Royal Enfield is capable of far better quality finishing and paintwork than I can see on my bike. And it seems to me that obviously something has just gone wrong with a batch of red and chrome paintwork. What I will say is that these particular defects are, in my opinion, only likely to be an issue on the chrome models. They won't affect the all one colour models. And I will make a video in the future just going over what the problems are with this paintwork. The mudguards I can correct myself, that isn't a problem, and I'll show you how to do that if you encounter this issue. But the tank will have to be replaced under warranty, and I'll let you know how that goes as time goes on. Now, it's strange, I do feel a bit disloyal to Royal Enfield for bringing this up. but you watch my reviews to get the truth, and I think I would have felt like I was turning my back on my own integrity if I hadn't brought it up. Just to put this into perspective, I have had very similar issues with two BMWs and a Suzuki in the past. This isn't the kind of problem that is just sort of unique to Royal Enfield. You get these problems throughout the motor industry. I think all that really matters now is how Royal Enfield respond to the warranty claim. Now, having got that out of the way, I'm pleased to report that everything else on the bike is absolutely spot on. They've clearly upgraded and altered some aspects of the bike that were a bone of contention in the past. We've got proper foot pegs that will fall back if you get too over enthusiastic with your cornering, which do also look more premium. They've also managed to make the exhaust look more aesthetically pleasing than the previous version by sort of telescoping it down gradually so it looks less bulbous. And although not perfect, it now looks much more in proportion with the bike. They've also downsized the indicator slightly whilst retaining the similar overall design, which is a very welcome change in my book. The control levers and the switchgear are far higher quality than we saw on the last iteration of this bike, and the switchgear is very ergonomic. It works really well and it's intuitive to use, which really, coming towards the end of this video, leaves me to answer those questions that I've been receiving over the last 3 weeks since I received this bike. Is it a better bike than the previous iteration of the Bullet? And what kind of people is this bike going to appeal to? Now, the simple answer to that first question is yes, this is a vastly superior bike to the original version or the outgoing version. The old Bullet was a culmination of decades of tweaking and evolution, but at its heart it was still essentially a 1940s motorcycle, and there were limits to how far that could be improved. Now, some will say, and to a great extent I would agree with them, that that was the charm and the beauty of that motorcycle. It was still, in a lot of ways, very primitive and rough around the edges. And I know a lot of people are going to lament the end of that. Royal Enfield could very easily have got this totally wrong and messed up, what, nearly 90 years of evolution. But they've managed to retain the essence of what the Classic or the Bullet is, whilst updating it to a far more refined, user-friendly machine. This new model has gained something like 3 horsepower over the outgoing 350, but it's still about 8 horsepower below the outgoing 500. And we still don't know at this stage whether there is any intention by Royal Enfield to bring a larger, more powerful machine to the market. And that sounds like a lot. I mean, it's almost a third power loss if you've got one of the old 500s and you're looking to upgrade to the 350. But you know, that's not the full story. Squeezing the full 28 horsepower out of the 500 is a frenetic, involved process. It feels urgent, it feels desperate, and you certainly feel as though you're doing that bike a grave disservice. And all that in order to achieve a terminal velocity of just over 80 miles an hour. We know that this new 350 is good for just over 70 miles an hour, so in the greater scheme of things, the difference between the two isn't vast. The big difference is that this new bike delivers that in a much more refined, civilised, let's say more gentlemanly manner. This bike feels more together, it feels more secure, and it delivers what performance it has in a modern and calmer way. This bike has charisma. and I'm sure that it's capable of doing just about anything. It's going to be a good commuter, a good weekend pleasure bike, and it's going to be perfectly capable of relaxed long distance touring. It's not a fast bike, but touring is not a race. It's about enjoying the ride and soaking in the scenery, not getting from A to B as quickly as humanly possible. And who is it going to appeal to? Well, yeah, a bike like this is going to appeal to the novice or A2 license holder. It's perfect for that. It's gentle, it's predictable. It still has enough power to be exhilarating when you're seeking a thrill, but it'll fit into a group of bikes that is least likely to get you into trouble. I know from running this channel that youngsters around the world appreciate classic heritage. This is the Roberts revival radio of the motorcycle world. It's the Rolex Explorer of the motorcycle world, except it's cheaper. And it's a bike that the older, discerning motorcyclist can also appreciate. It does exactly what he needs it to do and no more, but with bags of character and almost 90 years of heritage. I fell in love with this bike within the first 20 miles. This is a bike that my father and other riders back in the 1950s and 1960s would instantly recognise, but it now comes with a level of performance and refinement that they could only ever have dreamed of. Once again, thank you so much for watching this video and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I'd also appreciate it if you would leave a like and hit that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything. It's instantly revocable if you change your mind, and it's the only gentlemanly thing to do. I've already got some bolt-on goodies ready to fit to this bike, or at least I've got them on order. They haven't arrived yet. But rest assured, we're going to have a fun-packed summer this summer, exploring the limits of this bike and what can be done with it. Being a subscriber will help you be part of that. I am, of course, going to be back on Friday, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.